My friends, the writing is on the wall for Avdiivka.
All hope is failing, my lord! The battle is almost done!
And you know the situation is bad when Newsweek reuses History Legends headlines. Avdiivka is about to fall. That's because the last time we saw each other, that was a situation on the front line with a Russian breakthrough south of the city. And this is the situation now. It's breakthrough season. But this time, north of Avdiivka. The Russians aimed for the crack and poured their hardest assault units through the breach. This was followed by a complete collapse of Ukrainian positions in the sector.
Emotional damage!
Isn't it exactly what I told you last video? If the Russians continue their attacks, the Ukrainian flanks will be exposed and they will be forced to abandon their positions or face encirclement. Alright guys, I've watched YouTube video. We are screwed. Let's pull back now. Ukrainian war reporter Andriy Tyaplenko wrote the following on his Telegram channel. According to my sources in Avdiivka, the situation in the city has become critical. Yet, according to some YouTubers, the Russian army was crushed in Avdiivka. They're suffering catastrophic losses from which they cannot recover. Meanwhile, in an interview with the New Voice of Ukraine, the former company commander of the Aidar battalion, Yevhen Dyky, admitted the possibility of surrendering Avdiivka. However, my friends, rest assured, a new Wunderwaffe has appeared on the battlefield. That's right, an M1A1 Abrams was spotted near the front in Avdiivka.
Saruman will have his prize.
On the 2nd of February, German media Spiegel published this article. Forgive my accent. Manche teilen den Schützengraben mit Toten. Some share the trenches with the dead. We're presented with a 45-year-old Ukrainian infantryman called Ole, fighting somewhere in Avdiivka. Like many others, he volunteered at the beginning of the war. But now, he says, he's exhausted. He told the German journalists, the soldiers report that of the almost 100 people in their company, only 20 can still fight. Currently, the 110th Mechanized Brigade is almost alone against wave after wave of Russian veteran assault detachments, also known as Wagnerians. Meanwhile, on the 4th of February, Ukrainian journalist Yuri Butusov said on his Telegram channel, Avdiivka needs fresh reserves and rotation of units for the heroic 110th Brigade, which maintains control despite absolute exhaustion after almost 2 years of continuous fighting in the town. And this critical situation could become even worse in the coming days, with Russian troops only 900 meters away from the main supply line in Avdiivka, and overall they're 5 kilometers away from encircling the city. As we unfold the latest events in Avdiivka, we'll also have to cover everything that's happening throughout the Donetsk front, so you can get a full picture of the battlefield. Spoilers, although Russian armored columns got clapped near Novomikhailivka, they're not giving up. Fighting is now reported north, east, and south of Novomikhailivka, meaning the Ukrainians might be forced to commit an early pullout from the village. On top of that, with the latest Russian gains in Pervomaivske and Heorivka, we can believe the Russian command is already preparing for follow-up operations after the fall of Avdiivka. Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukrainian War. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my Ukraine videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped. And welcome to the headquarters. So yeah, in my last Avdiivka update, the Russians had captured this entire residential sector after infiltrating behind Ukrainian positions through an ex-Soviet era pipeline. The assault was conducted with assault squads of the DSHK, or Volunteer Assault Corps. In an interview with Russian TV, they said, "Most of the time you walk, you endure. This is a battle of characters. Shooting is not as difficult as enduring all of it, the cold, the dirt." Talking about the DSHK, Commander Lotus from Wagner finally reappeared.
Я жив-здоров, нахожусь в казачьих лагерях, в штабе. Численность нашего корпуса будет составлять 45 тысяч человек. Мы здесь строим лагерь для того, чтобы подразделения, которые будут формироваться и входить в состав добровольческого корпуса Росгвардии, могли прибывать и расселяться.
For many days, the Ukrainians sent all available reserves to counterattack and reclaim the position called Tsarskaya Khota, or in English, the Tsar's Hunt. And the problem of the tight streets is that it is as hard for the Russians to push beyond their initial gains as it is for the Ukrainians to counterattack. As you can see in this video, here's a complex of the Tsar's Hunt, and this is the residential sector the Russians captured. Because the Ukrainian troops defending the southern part of Avdiivka lacked armored vehicles, most of these counterattacks were carried by men of the 47th and 116th Mechanized Brigades that were transferred from the northern sectors to the south. Here you can see one such Ukrainian raid, composed of one M2 Bradley followed by an M113, both pushing along this road. That's when they arrived 70 meters away from the Tsar's Hunt. The M2 Bradley engages the enemy and provides suppressive fire, while the M113 behind disembarked 7 riflemen, who quickly exchanged fire as well with the Russian defenders. Once the infantry took positions in the woods, the M113 retreated, and that's when the Bradley disembarked his own troops as well. However, as you can see on this map, this entire sector is now clearly under Russian hands, meaning the Ukrainian assault squads failed to reconquer the lost ground. According to Russian Telegram, the Russians have stormed this entire sector, and thus we can assume that the Ukrainians have redeployed their forces along this residential sector. On the 31st of January, we got video evidence of yet another Ukrainian armored raid. We see some infantry with a tank in support firing at point blank at a building housing Russian troops. This video was geolocated right here at the tip of Sportivna Street. A couple days later, an M2 Bradley pushed along Chernyshevskoho Street until it was put out of action by a mine, forcing its crew to abandon ship. As you can see, the Russians have almost completed the capture of this part of the city, and after 2 weeks, the Ukrainians have still not been able to dislodge them. Lastly, as of the 5th of February, this Russian drone footage was released. We see the Tsar's Hunt and its surroundings. The drone operators are impressed with all the progress their troops have achieved, and how all the positions are now fully manned by Russian riflemen. At this point of the battle, as the Ukrainians were trying to contain this sudden breakthrough, the Russian 114th Brigade was preparing for the coup de grâce. The worst is that at the end of January, early February, pro-Ukrainian channels were claiming everything was under control. And one day later, it all collapsed. On February 1st, Ukrainian forces released the following footage of an FPV drone strike deleting Russian soldiers. Problem is, these houses they struck were geolocated 1.6 kilometers south of the previous Russian positions. I mean, according to pro-Ukrainian map Deep State UA, on the 2nd of February, the contact line was here. And by the next day, on February 3rd, they pushed 1,600 meters. I mean, that's insane. If we take a closer look at it, there are at least 200 houses, plus a couple woods. How did they do it? Was there another unmarked pipeline or something? Realistically, we can think that a mechanized column attacked across this field. And because it was successful, of course, we get no drone footage from the Ukrainian side. Simultaneously, the Russian 114th Brigade also launched an attack from the east, right along this lake. Once again, this was confirmed via Ukrainian FPV drone strikes. This one is seen destroying a Russian tank from the rear. And this event was geolocated right here on the map. You don't have to be a tactical genius to understand that the Russian plan was to take all these Ukrainian troops in a pincer and force the enemy to abandon their positions or face encirclement. And the Russians swiftly made sure to fully occupy all these positions and prevent these retreating Ukrainians to set up a new set of defenses. If things could not get worse, by the evening of the 4th of February, the Ukrainians tried to counterattack. We know this because of the following video. We can see the remnants of a squad of Ukrainian soldiers driven out from this residential sector and now hiding under a bridge. This means that the Russians have pushed inside this area as well, and at that point, advanced elements of the Russian army were less than a kilometer away, from Avdiivka's main supply line, and to make life hell for the Ukrainian defenders of this fortress. That's when Russian aviation dropped multiple FAB-500 bombs on any major building that could house enemy forces. Here's a video of this event. We can see the coke plant at the rear, the citadel at the forefront, so logically the bombardment took place somewhere here, right along the train tracks. And here's what a Ukrainian soldier had to say about these endless aerial bombardments.
Да, дуже багато кабів-фобів, крупнокаліберний, стрілкатня, понятно, вона по кругу. Ну, ситуація така, як є. Будемо бачити розвиток подій найближчими днями.
And according to the latest news on the 6th of February, the Russians captured the railway bridge we just saw and advanced another 400 meters towards the city center. From this moment on, the Russians have multiple options. Option 1, take this salient into a pincer, similar to what they've just done, this time both from the north and the south. Once again, in order to flush out the Ukrainian defenders out from their fortifications. Option 2 would be much more direct, converge on the citadel from all directions. And this would complete the capture of Avdiivka once and for all. Let's move back to the south for a minute. In regards to the situation with the Zenit air defense base, the relationship status is complicated. In this video, we see a Ukrainian FPV drone coming right in the face of a dugout with 4 poor Russian riflemen inside. On a side note, these videos are not fun to watch. I always try to emotionally disconnect myself from it the best I can. I mean, at the end of the day, those are people, right? Yeah, so this aerial attack took place on February 1st, right here on the map. This means Russian troops pushed 600 meters from their positions east of Opitne. The next day, on February 2nd, the Russians released this video of intense TOS artillery shelling. We're talking about 17 shells landing within 10 seconds. And that happened 1.4 kilometers north of the Zenit air defense base. To me, it's clear that the Russian intention is to take Zenit into a pincer. Oh, but you said that the Russians had captured it. Well, yeah, they did, until the Ukrainians counterattacked and regained control of the northern part of the base. Meanwhile, in Pervomaivske, although the Russians were not able to push further along Naberezhna Street, on the 2nd of February, a Russian BMP was seen disembarking troops right here, 1.6 kilometers away from the contact line of the previous day. Of course, we can assume that there's a lot of back and forth, but it's clear that now the Russian plan is to increase the pressure on the village in order to be able to bring the fight to Netailove, which controls the southern supply line going towards Avdiivka. Now let's move further to the south to Marinka. Here's the situation on the 13th of January, and then please take a look at all the additional artillery shells by the end of the 23rd. There are more craters than on the face of a teenager. We can clearly see that the Russian howitzers focused their attention on 4 key locations. Here, part of the village here, which as you can see in this video is all ruins now, and then these 2 strongholds south of Marinka. These artillery strikes are done in order to soften Ukrainian positions prior to an assault, but they can also be done to confuse the defender on what positions will actually be attacked. For example, right here there's 4 locations the Russians primarily bombarded, meaning the Russians could launch diversion attacks on these positions in the south in order to draw all the Ukrainian reinforcements there and instead concentrate their forces to the north. And that's exactly what happened. In my last video, I told you how the Russians had captured this area with the church, but it seems the Russians were stopped somewhere around here. However, by February 1st, according to Suryak maps, the Russians pivoted their axis of attack and pushed north. This is how they captured this entire tree line as well as half of this one. I actually have a video of this attack to show you. Here you can see a recon unit of 3 Russian soldiers that are part of the 5th Brigade of the DPR. Eventually they come into contact with enemy troops. Then we see at least 6 Russian stormtroopers clearing some sort of defensive network composed of trenches and underground positions. And this is where we see a squad of 7 Ukrainians just fleeing from these trenches.
Shameful display! A unit is running from the battlefield!
This firefight was geolocated right here as part of the assault on this tree line. What's interesting is that I also found an interview of the commander of an assault detachment around that sector, and his call sign was Yalta. And in the video he explains precisely how he trained his men prior to this special mission.
В течение месяца мы подготовили группу, специально штурмовую группу. Ландшафт местности мы построили специально. Отдельный окоп для этого. В течение 2 месяцев я ребят этих тренировал. Я знал каждого из них, знал, что может сделать каждый из них, и знал, на что они способны.
Alright, boys and girls, we're back in Novomikhailivka. Last video we analyzed the Russian failure to capture the village, but the Russians were ready for round 2. On January 28th, the Russians launched a simultaneous offensive north and south to bypass this stronghold. We all know that if you double the investment, you will naturally get twice the returns, right? Let's start with the southern push led by the Marines of the 155th Naval Brigade of the Pacific. After an intense artillery preparation, Russian assault formations pushed forward. In this video, you can see an armored column of at least 12 vehicles driving along a road. I think the objective of this attack was clear, a bit too clear, since the artillery preparation that preceded the assault clearly pounded only this one tree line. The vehicles were targeted by very precise artillery fire. That's when the Russian vehicles attempted to cross these fields, and it didn't end well. They got absolutely hammered by swarms of FPV drones, who double-tapped a lot of already immobilized tanks. In the end, during this ill-fated assault, the Russian army left behind 6 tanks and 4 IFVs. It's hard to analyze what actually happened because we only have little glimpses of the battle. For example, in this video we see the perspective of a squad of riflemen in that same sector. At one point they disembark and jump from one crater to another because of the complete lack of cover. Ukrainians are not far in front. For some time they're pinned down by mortars until they manage to take hold of some trenches. The media talked a lot about the lack of artillery shells for the Ukrainian army and how foreign deliveries are so low, which obviously leads to a decrease of firepower for the Ukrainian artillery. But the Ukrainian army, they're smart, and they compensated for this loss with a drastic increase of locally produced FPV drones. And from what we see, this was a highly effective change of doctrine. Although it's not as if they really had a choice. But it's not a foolproof solution, I'll tell you why in a minute. In the northern sector, the Russian army had more luck. By the afternoon of the 28th of January, they managed to capture all these tree lines and advanced a total of 2 kilometers. Most importantly, they fully secured the stronghold called Zverinets, or the zoo. Here we even have a first-person view of the position from the perspective of a Russian war reporter. And the loss of this outpost spells trouble for the Ukrainians. And by the 31st of January, Russian stormtroopers pushed another 500 to 1,000 meters. From there we can expect the 33rd Russian Motor Rifle Regiment to continue in this direction and to flank Novomikhailivka from the north. They could even aim for Paraskovivka, which would directly threaten the supply lines for the Ukrainian grouping. And in the end, south of Novomikhailivka, the Russians were ready for round 3 as the 155th Naval Brigade launched a follow-up attack. This time it was carried out at night time. A mine-rolling tank preceded the column to clear passages through minefields, and each BMP was equipped with proper electronic warfare assets, thus making them immune to FPV attacks. Essentially, the Ukrainian drones would get jammed before even reaching their targets. And according to the latest news, the Russians have once again established a foothold in the eastern part of Novomikhailivka. In this video, we've seen many Russian assaults, some of them successful, some of them were disasters. Most of the time, the results of these attacks depends on the commanders that planned the assault. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. It's not because one Russian column gets destroyed that the entire doctrine of the Russian army is obsolete. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.